Well, many people here and around the world joining vigils for journalists who've been killed by Israeli forces in Gaza. The Committee to Protect Journalists says that at least 83 journalists have been killed in Gaza since Israeli forces started attacking the enclave. In some cases, Israel's been accused of deliberately targeting reporters. In Makhanda, members of Rhodes University, including their journalism department, are going to hold a vigil for journalists. That's one of several which are planned. Dr. Kealeboga Aiseng is the deputy head of department at the Rhodes University School of Journalism and Media Studies. Dr. Aiseng, good afternoon to you. What kind of action are you planning? I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. Yeah, go ahead.
So as the Rhodes University School of Journalism and Media Studies, we've been working together with the community members to organize a night vigil, together with colleagues across the country, to organize a night vigil for the journalists that have been killed in Gaza since the 7th of October until today, basically, or even yesterday, depending on the statistics and how you look at them. So the night vigil will be held on Sunday, the 28th of January at 6 p.m. here at Rhodes University. And I'm sure colleagues across the world, whether in practice or universities, will also be doing the same thing, the night vigil, right at that particular time.
Journalists have been covering conflicts and formal wars since at least the Crimean War over 150 years ago. Have we ever seen so many journalists being killed in a conflict like this before? It's a conflict in a very concentrated area, and a very high number of journalists have been killed.
The answer is no. Statistics that were, you talked about the center, the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is an organization or a community that looks at the protection of journalists across the world. Yesterday, the statement that they released, they indicated that the war, the Israel and Palestinian war, is the deadliest they've ever seen for journalists. So you're quite right. Journalists have been covering conflicts, wars, protests. They covered the Rwandan genocide. They covered so many conflicts across the world. And CPJ says this is the deadliest war they've ever seen for journalists, meaning that there have been more journalists killed, injured, harassed, and all sorts of things in this war than they've ever seen since they began gathering data in 1992. So you can just count how many conflicts, global conflicts you've seen from 1992 to this year. And they say in that particular period when they started gathering this data, this is the deadliest war they've ever seen for journalists.
Journalists are usually wearing tags and clothes that clearly define them as media. Everybody knows sort of what a journalist looks like in a way. They're usually carrying a video camera of some kind. Do you think they're being targeted deliberately? Is Israel targeting them deliberately?
Remember, Stephen, journalists play a very important role in terms of conflict. For someone like me who's never been to Palestine, who's never been to Israel, the only way I get to know about what is happening there is through the media. It's through photographers, it's through camera operators, reporters, journalists, and stuff like that. So when you target these people, what are you doing? You kind of limiting people's access to that world. What people get to know then is reduced significantly. That is why in certain countries there is censorship. Because once you've censored the media, then you've reduced people's access to information. So what is happening in Israel, in Palestine, the war between Israel and Palestine, it's a very sad thing where journalists, yes, and the report says that it seems like journalists are being deliberately targeted in order to curtail, to reduce, to block people's view into that particular world. Because as the saying goes, what is not in the media, it's not there. We don't know about it. If it's not in the media, it doesn't matter. So this is what we are seeing right now. Hence, statistics and reports show that with so many journalists being killed, there are beliefs that there are attempts to kill and attack journalists, deliberately. In one of the statements that, CPJ released, they said, at one point, Reuters journalists were talking with Israeli armed forces and asking if they will be protected. They said, no, we can't guarantee your protection. In other words, there is no distinction between the police, journalists, the soldiers and stuff like that. We all see enemies, so just kill everyone.
Sure. Doctor, I mean, if we don't have journalists in Gaza, that means we won't know what's actually going on here. And I mean, we've seen so many images of the sort of full horror of what's happening in Gaza. Getting information out of Gaza is very difficult. So, I mean, are people trying to really stop us from knowing what's happening? And this is really part of a disinformation war, isn't it? In all conflicts, you have deliberate disinformation. We see it in Russia and Ukraine. I'm sure we see it in this conflict too. I mean, if you kill journalists, the people who are lying will win.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Stephen. Remember, I mean, we train journalists. It's part of our job. In the next 2 weeks, they'll be arriving here. We're going to train them that part of your job is to inform, is to provide knowledge, is to educate, is to entertain. That's what we train them to do. So you leave this world knowing that, you leave this place, these four walls of Rhodes University, knowing that your job is to inform, is to educate, is to entertain, and stuff like that. You do that impartially, you do that objectively and fairly. Now you get to a situation whereby you are going to be brutally killed. Your family is going to be brutally killed. So what happens from there? You might resist as a person. You forget that you are a journalist. You remember that, number one, you are a human being. You became a journalist later. You resist from performing your duties. What happens as a result? Anyone can spread whatever they want to say. People can just wake up, type statements, release them, and people read it. They don't know. They won't know the truth because there is no one to ask questions. There is no one to critique. There is no one to investigate. So once you kill journalists, you are targeting a very important segment of the society, which is responsible for knowledge and information and distribution. That's what journalists do. As you're sitting here today, you and I, we are distributing knowledge to the people, but then, knowledge and information. If you are being targeted, Stephen, you are going to ask me some silly questions so that you can serve the interest of whoever is responsible for targeting you. So that is what is happening in Gaza. With all these journalists being targeted and stuff like that, we are going to end up with misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and all sorts of things that are happening in this world that people do not deserve.
If it works for whoever's doing this in Gaza, I mean, it's going to happen in other conflicts too, and we've seen that, haven't we? Journalists are suddenly a lot more vulnerable than they used to be.
Absolutely. Research has already shown that across the world. In fact, the CPG released report statistics, I think a day or two ago, saying that more than 360 journalists are jailed across the world. They are imprisoned. Now and then when you're watching Al Jazeera, you'll hear that a certain journalist has been imprisoned in Egypt, in Yemen, and all these countries for more than a year without trial. Without trial. Very important to know that. So it is happening. It has been happening. It's not new. And it will continue to happen. So other countries, they are watching. And they can notice that there is little protection for journalists across the world. So whenever there is conflict, whenever there are some terrible protests, you can just cut off journalists and then you have free access in your own world. You have free access to the people. So it has been happening. Journalists are jailed, journalists are killed, journalists are being censored, and even in social media they're being targeted. It's a mess.
Dr. Kealeboga Aiseng, thank you. Aiseng, the Deputy Head of Department of the Rhodes University School of Journalism and Media Studies. Really appreciate the time.